In 1890, a column of men crossed the Limpopo River, which was the northern border of South Africa, and marched into what later would become Rhodesia, then in 1980 Zimbabwe. The men were led by Cecil John Rhodes, a British mining magnate who had a company incorporated under Royal Charter in October 1889. That was known as the British South Africa Company. The Royal Charter was originally granted for a period of 25 years and was extended for another 10 years in 1915. The purpose of the company was to acquire and exercise commercial rights in South Central Africa. Cecil Rhodes originally made his fortune by buying up and consolidating diamond mines. He did this by obtaining funding from Rothschilds & Co. Those consolidated mines were incorporated into a company in 1888, and that was known as De Beers. The British South Africa Company managed to conquer or negotiate their way over a landmass that covers Zambia or Northern Rhodesia, Malawi or Nyasaland, and Zimbabwe or Southern Rhodesia. Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland became British protectorates, while Southern Rhodesia became largely independent, with the people, both black and white, living mainly in peace with each other. When World War I came along, a large percentage of Southern Rhodesians volunteered to fight for the British. Then after the war, the country boomed, and in 1922, the people were given the choice of joining South Africa as its fifth province or becoming a self-governing territory. They voted to become a self-governing territory. Then, when World War II came along, substantially more Rhodesians volunteered to fight for Britain. After the war, they returned home and Southern Rhodesia boomed again. In the early 1950s, the British government started discussing the idea of the amalgamation of the two British protectorates of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland with the independent territory of Southern Rhodesia. This came into reality in 1953, when the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was created. This federation lasted a whole 10 years before being dissolved in 1963. In 1964, Nyasaland was granted independence on July 6 and became Malawi, while Northern Rhodesia became independent on October 24, 1964, and then became Zambia. Even though Southern Rhodesia or Rhodesia was a peaceful, largely problem-free country, the residents could only watch in horror what was happening elsewhere in Africa with shock. Apartheid never existed, but Britain was not happy with the majority white rule, regardless of the lack of racial tensions. Despite giving independence to Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, Britain refused to give Rhodesia independence unless the country became a majority black rule. In early 1962, the Rhodesian Front was co-founded by Douglas Collett Lifford, a wealthy Rhodesian tobacco farmer who would later be murdered in Zimbabwe in 1985, and Ian Smith, a politician, a farmer, and a former fighter pilot who served in the Royal Air Force in World War II. The Rhodesian Front needed an establishment figurehead, so they asked serving politician Winston Field. He accepted, and in December 1962, the Rhodesian Front won the election. But Winston Field proved to be too weak and was replaced as Prime Minister by Ian Smith on April 13, 1964. One of Ian Smith's first action was to clamp down on the black nationalist political violence. There were two nationalist organisations banned in August 1964. The first, led by Robert Mugabe, that was the Zimbabwe African National Union, or ZANU, which was formed in Tanzania in 1963 by former disgruntled members of the Zimbabwean African People's Union, or ZAPU. ZANU was not only tribally different, but was aligned with Maoism and was mainly supported by Communist China. Then when the Rhodesian Bush War broke out, they had their bases mainly in Mozambique. ZAPU was led by Michael Nkomo and was aligned and was mainly supported by the now-defunct Soviet Union. And when the Rhodesian Bush War broke out, their operating bases were mainly in Zambia, the former Northern Rhodesia, but also in Botswana. In May 1963, the Organisation of African Unity, or OAU, was set up with one of its goals to end colonialism and white minority rule. This meant that member countries gave weapons, training and military bases to ZANU and ZAPU. The OAU had a policy of not intervening in domestic affairs. The organisation failed to protect African citizens from their own political leaders, leading to the organisation being nicknamed the Dictators Club. In October 1964, the Conservative government narrowly lost the British election to the Labour Party under Harold Wilson. The new government refused to give independence to Rhodesia, and after a lot of haggling between the two countries, the government of Ian Smith signed a unilateral declaration of independence at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1965. Rhodesians took all this in their stride. The Wilson government was shocked by the move. The colonial governor, Sir Humphrey Gibbs, tried to formally sack the Smith government, but was totally ignored, with the governor's office declared obsolete under the Unilateral Declaration of Independence. The British did all they could to impose an international economic embargo on Rhodesia, but the sanctions had little effect, as they could get their oil and other essential resources through South Africa and Portugal. The Rhodesians were originally getting oil through Mozambique, but the Wilson government ordered a naval flotilla to blockade the port of entry, Beira. As the British government was throwing tantrums and complaining, the various communist countries seen this as an opportunity to start openly funding and arming the two banned groups, ZANU and ZAPU. As other countries across Africa fell to the Marxist-supported nationalists, Rhodesia prepared for the coming fight.